after a devastating accident leaves her injured and struggling to provide for her young son, a single mother treks through a brutal snowstorm seeking help. She stumbles upon a massive, isolated mansion buried in deep snow, its windows dark, its gates half frozen. Desperation drives her inside, but as she explores the eerie halls, she discovers a hidden room concealed behind a bookshelf. Inside lies a long-buried secret tied to her past, one powerful enough to rewrite everything she believed about her family, her identity, and her future. What she finds in that frozen mansion will force her to confront a truth she never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks before Sarah Chen found herself standing at the gates of that snow-buried mansion, she was sitting in the billing office of Valley Medical Center, staring at numbers that might as well have been written in a foreign language. The kind woman behind the desk, probably close to retirement herself, wore a sympathetic expression that Sarah had seen too many times lately. "Mrs. Chen, we can set up a payment plan," the woman said gently, sliding a form across the desk. "Something manageable." Sarah looked down at the hospital discharge papers in her lap. The total at the bottom made her stomach tighten. $43,000 for 3 days in the hospital, surgery to repair her shoulder, physical therapy consultations she'd never be able to afford, all because of black ice on Route 47 and a moment of lost control. "I'm not Mrs. Chen," Sarah said quietly, a good hand smoothing the papers. "Just Miss Chen. And I appreciate the offer, but I need to figure some things out first." The truth was simpler and harder than that. She had no idea how she was going to pay any of it. Her savings account, carefully built over years of double shifts and skipped luxuries, had already been drained to cover the first week of missed work. The disability payment wouldn't come for another month, and even then, it would barely cover rent. Sarah stood, tucking the papers into her purse with her left hand. Her right arm hung in a sling, the shoulders still aching despite the pain medication. The orthopedic surgeon had been clear 6 to 8 weeks before she could return to work. Maybe longer, depending on how the healing went. She was a nurse's aide, a job that required lifting, turning, and supporting patients who couldn't support themselves. There was no light-duty option. The parking lot outside was grey with late November cold. Sarah's sedan, a 2008 Honda with a new dent in the front bumper, sat under a bare oak tree. She eased into the driver's seat, careful not to jar her shoulder, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Morrison, her neighbor who'd been watching Tommy after school. "He's fine. Did his homework. We made cookies. No rush." Sarah felt the familiar weight of gratitude and guilt. Mrs. Morrison was 72, living on Social Security, and refused to take money for watching Tommy. "He's good company," she always said. "Reminds me of my grandson, Tommy. 7 years old, gap-toothed smile, too smart for his own good." He still believed his mother could fix anything. Sarah needed to keep it that way for as long as possible. She drove the familiar route back to their apartment complex on the east side of Pine Ridge. The town of 11,000 people sat in the valley between two mountain ranges, close enough to ski resorts to have tourists in winter, but not close enough to benefit much from their money. Most people worked at the hospital, the lumber mill, or one of the chain stores out by the highway. Sarah had lived here her whole life, except for 2 years at community college in the next county. She'd planned to become a registered nurse, but then she got pregnant, and Marcus, Tommy's father, had promised they'd figure it out together. That promise lasted until Tommy was 18 months old. Then Marcus figured out he wanted to figure things out in Arizona with a woman he'd met online. The divorce was quick. The child support was theoretical. Sarah had learned not to expect much beyond the occasional birthday card with a $20 bill inside. She pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Apartments, though there was no river anywhere nearby. The 2-story building had seen better decades, but the rent was manageable and the schools were decent. That was what mattered. Mrs. Morrison opened her door before Sarah could knock. She had that ability, hearing footsteps and knowing who they belonged to. "Come in, dear. Tommy's building something with those blocks I found in the closet. Tommy looked up from the living room floor, his face bright. Mom, look, I made a hospital. See? That's the emergency room, and that's where you were. Sarah's throat tightened. She crossed the room and lowered herself carefully to the floor beside him, kissing the top of his head. He smelled like chocolate chips and that particular little boy mixture of soap and playground dirt. That's really good, buddy. You're quite the architect. Mrs. Morrison says architects design buildings. I think I might want to do that. Last week you wanted to be a paleontologist, Sarah said, smiling. I can be both. Mrs. Morrison says you can do lots of things in life if you work hard. Mrs. Morrison, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, gave Sarah a look that said everything she couldn't say in front of Tommy. The older woman had been a teacher for 40 years. She could read a situation faster than most people could read a sentence. They stayed for another 20 minutes, long enough for Tommy to finish his architectural vision. Then Sarah gathered their things. The walk down the hall to their own apartment was short. Sarah unlocked the door and felt the familiar sense of stepping into a space that was truly theirs, however temporary it might be. The apartment was small, a living room that flowed into a kitchen, one bedroom that Tommy used, and a pull-out couch in the living room where Sarah slept. But she'd made it warm. Photographs on the walls, most of them Tommy at various ages. Curtains she'd sewn herself. A bookshelf filled with library finds, and Tommy's growing collection of chapter books. Tommy headed straight for the bathroom to wash his hands, a habit Sarah had instilled early. She moved to the kitchen and stared into the refrigerator. Eggs, milk that would expire tomorrow, some cheese, half a loaf of bread. She could make grilled cheese and scrambled eggs. Tommy wouldn't complain. He never did. While she cooked, Tommy set the table without being asked, placing the forks on the left side the way she'd taught him. He chatted about his day at school, about the book they were reading in class, about his friend Michael, who'd brought in a hermit crab for show and tell. Sarah listened, responding at the right moments, but part of her mind was calculating. The rent was due in a week, $850. Her checking account had $912. That left $62 for food, gas, utilities, and everything else until the disability payment came through. If it came through. She'd heard stories about people waiting months for approval. After dinner, Tommy did his homework at the kitchen table while Sarah washed dishes one-handed. The plate slipped, cracked against the sink, broke cleanly in half. She stared at it for a moment, this small, stupid loss, and felt tears prick her eyes. "Mom?" Tommy's voice was worried. "Are you okay?" She turned, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, honey, just clumsy tonight." But he was looking at her with those eyes that saw too much. 7 years old, and already learning that adults lie when they're trying to protect you. That night, after Tommy was asleep in his room, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open. The screen glowed blue in the darkness. She was looking at job listings, trying to find something she could do with one arm. Data entry, customer service, phone surveys. Nothing paid enough. Nothing would hire someone who couldn't start for 6 more weeks. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the door like something shameful. Sarah found it when she got up to make Tommy's breakfast. The paper was official, stamped and signed. 30 days to vacate or bring the account current. She was 2 months behind on rent. She'd told the building manager she would catch up after the disability payment came through, but apparently promises didn't count for much. Sarah folded the notice and put it in the drawer with the other bills she couldn't pay. Then she made oatmeal with cinnamon and sliced apples, the way Tommy liked it, and got him ready for school. At the bus stop, Tommy's friend Michael was showing off a new action figure. Tommy watched with polite interest, not asking for one himself. He'd stopped asking for things about a month ago, right around the time Sarah had started saying no to the small extras. No juice boxes in his lunch, just water. No movie rentals on Friday nights. No trips to the ice cream shop after school. Children pick up on these silences. They learn the landscape of what's possible and what isn't. After the bus pulled away, Sarah walked back to the apartment and stood in the kitchen, staring at her phone. There was one option she'd been avoiding, one person who might help, but the thought of making that call felt like swallowing glass. her Aunt Linda, her mother's older sister. They hadn't spoken in 8 years, not since Sarah's wedding. Linda had made her opinions clear about Marcus, about Sarah's choices, about everything. She'd been right, of course, but being right didn't make her easy to talk to. Linda lived 2 hours north, up in the mountains, in a house she'd inherited from her second husband. She'd sent a card when Tommy was born, another when Sarah's mother died. But they'd never been close, not really. There was too much history, too many old wounds that had never quite healed. Sarah picked up her phone, put it down, picked it up again. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. She dialed the number, her heart beating too fast. The phone rang 4 times. Sarah was about to hang up when Linda answered. "Hello? Aunt Linda. It's Sarah." A pause. "Sarah, it's been a while. I know. I'm sorry. I should have called sooner. I just wanted to see how you were doing." Another pause. Linda had always been good at hearing what people weren't saying. "What's wrong?" Sarah closed her eyes. "I had an accident. I'm out of work for a while. Things are tight. I was wondering if Tommy and I could stay with you for a bit, just until I get back on my feet." The silence stretched out. Sarah could hear the clock on the wall ticking, each second a small eternity. "I don't think that's a good idea," Linda said finally. "You know how I feel about people who don't plan ahead. You made your choices, Sarah. You have to live with them. Aunt Linda, I'm asking for help, for Tommy's sake. You should have thought about Tommy before you married that man, before you dropped out of school. I told you then, and I'll tell you now. You need to figure this out yourself. That's how people learn." Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. Right. Of course. I'm sorry I bothered you. She hung up before Linda could say anything else. Set the phone down on the counter, stared at nothing. For a long moment Sarah stood perfectly still. Then she went to the bathroom, closed the door, and cried as quietly as she could manage. When she was done, she washed her face, looked at herself in the mirror, and made a decision. She would drive up to Linda's house anyway. Show up in person, make her understand. Sometimes you had to push past pride and rejection and every defense you'd built. Sometimes you had to risk everything for the people you loved. Sarah spent the next 3 days planning the trip. She couldn't afford to plan it, really, but she couldn't afford not to either. The weather forecast called for snow in the mountains, but November snow was usually manageable. She'd driven in worse. She told Tommy they were going on an adventure to see Aunt Linda. He accepted this with the easy trust of childhood, excited to miss a day of school, to see mountains, to meet someone he barely remembered from a photograph. On Friday morning, Sarah packed their bags. Extra clothes, Tommy's favorite stuffed bear, the medications for her shoulder, snacks for the drive. She checked the car's oil, filled the gas tank with the last of her cash, and said a silent prayer to whatever might be listening. Mrs. Morrison stood in her doorway as they left, worry written across her face. "You be careful up there," she said. "Those mountain roads can be tricky." "We'll be fine," Sarah said, trying to sound confident. "I'll call when we get there." The drive started well enough. Tommy was animated in the passenger seat, pointing out cows in fields, commenting on the size of trucks that passed them, asking questions about everything. Sarah kept her eyes on the road and her good hand on the wheel, the injured shoulder braced with an extra pillow. They stopped for lunch at a diner halfway there, grilled cheese sandwiches and fries, hot chocolate for Tommy. The waitress was kind, didn't rush them, brought extra crackers without being asked. Small mercies. Back on the road, the landscape changed. The valley gave way to foothills, then to mountains proper. Pine trees crowded close to the highway. The sky, which had been grey all morning, darkened to something heavier. Snow began to fall around 2 o'clock. Light at first, just flurries that melted on the windshield. Tommy pressed his nose to the window, delighted. Sarah turned on the wipers and kept driving. By 3 o'clock, the snow was falling steadily. The road climbed higher, winding through passes where the trees stood thick on both sides. Traffic thinned. Sarah passed a sign, Pine Valley Summit, 15 miles. Linda's house was just beyond that. Tommy had fallen asleep, his head tilted against the window. Sarah envied him that peace. Her shoulder was aching despite the medication. She adjusted her grip on the wheel, keeping the car steady as the road curved. The snow was falling harder now. The wipers struggled to keep pace. Visibility dropped. Sarah slowed, following the taillights of a truck ahead of her. She couldn't see much beyond that, just white and grey and the occasional flash of reflectors marking the road's edge. The truck pulled off at an exit. Sarah kept going. She was close now. Another 10 miles, maybe 12. She could make it. The wind picked up. The snow came at the windshield sideways, hypnotic and disorienting. Sarah leaned forward, trying to see the road. The car's heater was running full blast, but she could feel the cold seeping in through the seals, through the very metal of the frame. She didn't see the ice patch until the car was on it. The sedan lurched, fishtailed. Sarah yanked the wheel, overcorrected. The car spun, slow and inevitable, like something happening in a dream. Trees rushed toward them, then away. The world tilted. They left the road with a sickening crunch, ploughing through a snowbank and into a drainage ditch. The airbag didn't deploy. The car simply stopped, wedged at an angle, the front end pointing down. Tommy woke with a gasp. "Mom, I'm here. I'm okay. Are you okay?" He nodded, eyes wide. Sarah's phone was on the floor somewhere. She felt for it, found it, saw the screen shattered into a web of cracks. She tried to turn it on. Nothing. Dead or broken, it didn't matter which. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and twisted to look at Tommy. He was pale but uninjured, still strapped safely in his booster seat. Outside, the snow fell in thick curtains, already beginning to cover the car's hood. "We're going to be okay," Sarah said, more to herself than to him. "We just need to stay calm." She tried the engine. It turned over once, twice, then died. The fuel gauge showed a quarter tank, but something in the impact must have damaged more than just the bumper. Sarah turned the key again. Nothing. The cold was immediate. Without the heater running, the temperature inside the car began to drop. Sarah could see her breath forming small clouds in the air. She looked around. They were at the bottom of a shallow ditch, surrounded by trees. The road was maybe 15 feet above them, but it might as well have been a mile. She couldn't see any lights, couldn't hear any traffic. The storm had swallowed everything. "Mom?" Tommy's voice was small. "What do we do?" Sarah forced her mind to work methodically. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She'd spent years working in a hospital, had seen crisis after crisis, had learned to function when everything was falling apart. She could do this. "We're going to stay warm, and we're going to find help," she said. "First, we need to get the emergency supplies from the trunk." She pushed her door open, fighting against the angle and the snow. Her shoulders screamed in protest, but she ignored it. The cold hit her like a physical thing, stealing her breath. She waded around to the back of the car, popped the trunk, and pulled out the emergency kit she'd kept there since Tommy was born. 2 blankets, a flashlight, a first aid kit, bottles of water and protein bars. Not much, but something. Back in the car, she wrapped Tommy in both blankets and gave him a protein bar. He ate it mechanically, his eyes tracking her every move. "I need to go look for help," Sarah said. "There might be a house nearby, or I might be able to flag down a car on the road. I want to come with you." "No, honey, it's too cold and I can move faster alone. You stay here, stay wrapped up, and I'll be back as soon as I can, I promise." She could see the fear in his eyes, the child's terror of being left alone. But she could also see his trust. He believed she would come back. That faith was both heartbreaking and fortifying. "Okay," he whispered. Sarah kissed his forehead. "I love you. Be brave." She took the flashlight and climbed out of the car again. The snow was already knee-deep in the ditch, deeper in the drifts. She struggled up the embankment, using her good arm to pull herself up by grabbing at exposed roots and rocks. On the road, the wind was worse. It cut through her jacket, through everything, finding every gap and weakness. The snow fell so thick she could barely see 10 feet ahead. No cars, no lights, just white and wind and cold. Sarah turned in a slow circle, trying to orient herself. The road stretched away in both directions, disappearing into the storm. She had no idea which way to go. Downhill might lead back toward civilization, but uphill continued toward Linda's house, if she could find it. She made a decision. Uphill. Linda's house was closer than anything else, and there was no guarantee of finding help going back the way they'd come. Sarah started walking. Each step was an effort. The snow dragged at her boots. The wind pushed against her. Her shoulder throbbed with every movement. She kept the flashlight beam pointed ahead, watching for any sign of life. 10 minutes passed. 20. Sarah's feet were numb. Her face felt like it was made of ice. She kept walking. Then, through the swirling snow, she saw something, a shape, angular and dark. She moved toward it, hope rising in her chest. Not a house, a gate. Tall iron posts, ornate metalwork, half buried in snow. The gate stood partially open, as if inviting her in. Beyond them, barely visible through the storm, was a driveway lined with trees. Sarah pushed through the gate and followed the driveway. Her legs were shaking with cold and exhaustion, but she kept moving. The trees formed a tunnel overhead, their branches heavy with snow. The beam of her flashlight bounced and wavered. Then the mansion appeared, rising out of the storm like something from another era. 3 stories tall, brick and stone, with tall windows that reflected nothing but darkness. Snow covered the roof, the steps, the dormers and gables. It looked abandoned, but Sarah didn't care. Abandoned meant shelter. Abandoned meant survival. She stumbled up the front steps, nearly fell, caught herself against the door. Her hand found the doorknob. She expected it to be locked, expected to have to break a window or find another way in. But the knob turned smoothly under her numb fingers. The door swung open. Sarah stepped into darkness and silence. She closed the door behind her, shutting out the wind and snow. For a moment she just stood there, breathing hard, her body shaking with cold and relief. The flashlight beam swept across a grand foyer. A chandelier hung overhead, dark with dust. A staircase curved upward to the right. To the left, an archway led into what might be a living room. Everything was draped in dust covers, shapes that had once been furniture now transformed into ghosts. "Hello?" Sarah called. Her voice echoed. No response. She moved deeper into the house, checking rooms. A dining room with a long table, a kitchen with appliances that looked decades old, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Everywhere the same sense of abandonment. No people, no recent signs of life, just a house that had been locked away and forgotten. Sarah found what she needed: blankets in a linen closet, preserved food in the pantry, firewood stacked by a massive fireplace in the living room. Her hands were still shaking, but she felt a flicker of hope. They could survive here, at least for tonight. But first, she had to get Tommy. The thought of going back out into the storm made her want to weep, but there was no choice. She couldn't leave him alone in that car any longer. Sarah gathered blankets, stuffed them into a large canvas bag she found in a closet, and steeled herself. The journey back was harder. The cold had settled deep into her bones. The wind seemed stronger, the snow heavier. But Sarah kept moving, following her own half-filled footprints back to the road, back to the place where they'd crashed. When she reached the car, Tommy was still wrapped in the blankets, still waiting. His face lit up when he saw her. "You came back," he said, as if there had been any doubt. "Of course I did. Come on, buddy." "I found us somewhere to stay." She helped him out of the car, wrapped him in the extra blankets, and lifted him as best she could with her good arm. He was getting too big to carry, but he wrapped his arms around her neck and his legs around her waist, and she managed. The walk back to the mansion was an eternity. Sarah focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Tommy's weight pressed against her injured shoulder, sending waves of pain through her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. By the time they reached the mansion's front door, Sarah was beyond exhaustion. She pushed inside, kicked the door closed, and lowered Tommy gently to the floor. Her legs gave out. She sat down hard on the cold marble, breathing in gasps. Tommy looked around with wide eyes. "Wow," he whispered. "It's like a castle." Sarah managed a weak laugh. "Yeah, like a castle. Are you cold?" "A little. Let's get you warm." She forced herself to stand, took Tommy's hand, and led him into the living room. Within minutes she had a fire started in the fireplace, using old newspapers and the dry wood. The flames caught and spread, filling the room with light and warmth. Tommy sat close to the fire, his face golden in the flickering glow. Sarah found cushions from under the dust covers, made a nest of blankets on the floor. She gave Tommy another protein bar and a bottle of water. "We'll stay here tonight," Sarah said. "Tomorrow, when the storm clears, we'll figure out what to do next." Tommy fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the ordeal. Sarah sat beside him, watching the fire burn down to embers, then building it up again. She was too cold, too wired, too aware of how close they'd come to disaster to even think about sleeping. In the firelight, the living room revealed itself slowly. Furniture that had probably been elegant once, now faded beneath its protective covers. A grand piano in the corner, its keys hidden under a cloth. Paintings on the walls, landscapes and portraits, all watching her with the peculiar attention of painted eyes. When the fire was strong and steady, Sarah stood and began to explore. She moved carefully, the flashlight beam cutting through darkness in the rooms beyond the fireplace's reach. The mansion was enormous. Room after room opened before her, each one filled with remnants of a life she couldn't begin to understand. In the foyer, she examined the chandelier more closely. Crystal, dust-covered, but still magnificent. The floor beneath her feet was marble, black and white in a checkerboard pattern. A coat rack near the door held nothing but wire hangers. She moved to the dining room. The table was set as if someone had been expecting guests. Plates with delicate gold trim, crystal glasses, silver cutlery laid out with precision. Dust covered everything like a fine grey snow. Sarah ran her finger along the edge of a plate, leaving a clean streak. How long had this place been empty? In the kitchen, she found more answers. The appliances were old but not ancient. A refrigerator from the 80s, a stove with coil burners. The pantry held canned goods with expiration dates from the mid-90s. Some had been opened, their contents long since gone to mold and ruin, but others remained sealed, preserved by time and tin. Sarah took inventory. Green beans, tomato soup, peaches in syrup, dry pasta in glass jars, rice, salt, pepper, enough to keep them fed for several days if needed. She found something else in the pantry, tucked on a high shelf behind the canned goods. A small wooden box, the kind that might hold jewelry. Sarah pulled it down, blew the dust off the lid, and opened it. Inside was a handkerchief, folded neatly, white linen with lace edges. When Sarah unfolded it, she found initials embroidered in one corner in elegant script, E.W. She stared at those letters for a long moment. E.W. They stirred something in her memory, some half-forgotten story her mother had told her once, but the memory wouldn't come clear. Sarah folded the handkerchief and put it in her pocket, then returned the box to its shelf. Back in the living room, Tommy was still asleep. Sarah added more wood to the fire, then moved to the windows. She pulled back the heavy curtains and looked out at the storm. The snow showed no signs of stopping. Drifts were building against the mansion's walls, burying the lower windows. They weren't going anywhere tomorrow. Sarah let the curtain fall back and turned to examine the room more carefully. The paintings on the walls drew her attention. Most were landscapes, mountains and forests rendered in oils. But there was one portrait, hanging above the mantel, that made her stop. It showed a young woman, maybe 25, with dark hair and serious eyes. She wore a dress from the 60s, simple and elegant. There was something familiar about her face, about the set of her jaw and the way she looked directly at the viewer. Sarah moved closer, tilting her head to see past the grime on the glass. The nameplate at the bottom of the frame was tarnished but readable, Eleanor Whitmore, 1965. Eleanor. Sarah's mother's maiden name had been Whitmore. Sarah stood very still, staring at the portrait. Her mother, Jennifer Whitmore Chen, had died when Sarah was 16, cancer fast and merciless. Before that, she'd been a librarian, quiet and careful with money, always choosing the practical over the extravagant. She'd never mentioned anything about coming from wealth, never talked about her childhood beyond vague references to growing up in the mountains. Sarah had always assumed that meant poverty, a hard-scrabble existence that her mother had escaped through education and determination. But this portrait, this mansion, told a different story entirely. Sarah pulled the handkerchief from her pocket and looked at the initials again. Eleanor Whitmore, her grandmother. Sarah had only the vaguest memories of her. An older woman with grey hair, a soft voice, hands that were always busy with knitting or cooking. She died when Sarah was 10, and afterward her mother had become even quieter, more withdrawn. Had her grandmother lived here, in this enormous house with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers? Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If this was true, if her family had owned this place, then why had her mother worked 40-hour weeks for modest pay? Why had Sarah grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment, wearing second-hand clothes and counting pennies for school supplies? Tommy stirred in his sleep, murmuring something. Sarah went to him, checked that he was warm enough, then continued her exploration. She needed to understand what this place was, what it meant. She climbed the grand staircase to the second floor. The hallway stretched in both directions, lined with doors. Sarah opened the first one, a bedroom, massive 4-poster bed, wardrobe, vanity with a mirror, all covered in dust, but preserved as if the occupant had simply walked away and never returned. Sarah moved to the vanity and opened the drawers. Jewelry boxes, mostly empty, hairbrushes with a few grey hairs still caught in the bristles, bottles of perfume, their scents long evaporated, and in the bottom drawer, a photograph album. Sarah lifted it carefully. The leather cover was embossed with gold, memories 1960 to 1970. She carried the album to the bed, sat down and opened it. The first page showed a young couple on their wedding day. The woman was Eleanor from the portrait, younger here, radiant in a white dress. The man beside her was handsome and confident, his hand resting possessively on her waist. A caption beneath read, "Charles and Eleanor, June 12, 1960. Sarah turned the pages, pictures of parties of Eleanor in elegant dresses, standing beside Charles in tuxedos. Pictures of this mansion in its prime, gardens manicured, windows bright, pictures of cars, of trips, of a life lived at a level Sarah had never imagined. Then, about halfway through the album, a baby appeared. A little girl in lacy dresses, in a high chair, in a crib. The captions identified her simply as Jenny. Sarah's heart clenched. Jenny, her mother's nickname, the one only her grandmother had used. She continued through the album. The pictures showed Jenny growing, toddler to child, always beautifully dressed, always photographed in this house or in similarly grand settings. But something changed as the pages turned. The pictures became less frequent. Eleanor appeared in fewer of them. The captions grew sparse. The last picture in the album showed Eleanor holding Jenny, who looked about 5 years old. They were sitting on a bench in what looked like the mansion's garden. Eleanor's face was sad, distant. Jenny looked at the camera with uncertain eyes. The caption read, "Last summer here, 1972. After that, blank pages, as if life had simply stopped being documented, stopped being worth remembering. Sarah closed the album and sat in the silent bedroom, trying to piece together a story that made sense. Her grandmother had lived here, wealthy and comfortable. Then something had happened in 1972, and she'd left. Left with a 5-year-old daughter, left behind all this wealth, and never spoken of it again. What could cause someone to walk away from this kind of life? Sarah stood and continued exploring. The next bedroom was clearly a child's room. Jenny's room, a canopy bed with pink bedding, now faded and dusty. Toys on shelves, dolls with porcelain faces, a rocking horse, building blocks, a small desk with crayons, still scattered across the surface, as if Jenny had been coloring one day and then simply never returned. Sarah touched the bedspread gently. Her mother had slept here, had played with these toys, had looked out this window at the same mountains Sarah could now see, snow-covered and distant. Why had no one ever told her? She moved through more rooms, guest bedrooms, a sewing room, a study, each one frozen in time, waiting for occupants who would never return. And, at the end of the hall, she found a door that was different from the others. This door was locked. Sarah tried the handle, pushed against it. Solid. She examined the lock, old-fashioned keyhole, the kind that required a skeleton key. She stepped back and looked at the door thoughtfully. Tommy's voice drifted up from downstairs. "Mom, I'm here, buddy, up on the second floor. You okay? I'm hungry." Sarah took one more look at the locked door, then headed back downstairs. Tommy was sitting up by the fire, wrapped in blankets, his hair sticking up in every direction. "How about some breakfast?" Sarah said. "I found food in the kitchen." They ate canned peaches and crackers, sitting on cushions by the fire. Tommy was full of questions about the house, about who lived here, about why it was empty. Sarah answered as best she could, leaving out the parts about her grandmother. She wanted to understand more before she tried to explain it to him. After breakfast, Sarah checked the windows. The storm had lessened but not stopped. Snow still fell, though lighter now. They'd be here at least another day. "Can we explore?" Tommy asked. "This place is so cool." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, but stay with me. I don't want you wandering off." They spent the morning going through rooms together. Tommy was delighted by everything, the piano, which he plunked experimentally until Sarah showed him how to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, the library, where he pulled books from shelves and examined their covers with reverence, the dining room, where he pretended to be a king at a feast. In the library, Sarah found something that made her pause, a desk in the corner, covered with papers. She moved closer, Tommy trailing behind her. Legal documents, estate papers, letters from lawyers. Sarah sifted through them carefully. The name Charles Whitmore appeared frequently. Details about the estate, about trusts and holdings, about property transfers, all dated from the 90s. One letter was more recent, dated 1995. Sarah read it carefully. It was a notification that Charles Whitmore had died intestate, without a will. The estate was in probate. Attempts to locate next of kin had failed. The property would eventually escheat to the state if no heirs came forward. Sarah sat down hard in the desk chair. Charles had died 30 years ago. Her grandmother Eleanor must have died around the same time, or shortly after, and no one had claimed this property because no one knew about it. Except Sarah knew about it now. She was Eleanor's granddaughter. If what she suspected was true, this mansion legally belonged to her. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. This wasn't just a place to shelter from the storm. This was her inheritance, her birthright. And somehow she'd stumbled into it by pure accident, or maybe not accident, maybe something deeper. Fate, if such things existed. The universe nudging her toward something she was meant to find. "Mom?" Tommy was looking at her with concern. "You okay?" Sarah shook her head, trying to clear it. Yeah, I'm fine, just thinking." "What are you thinking about?" "How to explain. I think this house belonged to my grandmother, your great-grandmother." Tommy's eyes widened. "Really? So does that mean it's ours?" "Maybe. I don't know yet. It's complicated. If it's ours, can we live here? It's way better than our apartment." Sarah almost laughed. The innocence of that statement, the simple child logic. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, we need to get through this storm and figure out how to get back to town." But even as she said it, Sarah's mind was racing ahead. If she could prove her relationship to Eleanor, if she could establish her claim to the property, then everything changed. She wouldn't need Linda's help. She wouldn't need to worry about eviction notices or medical bills. This mansion, even in its current state, was worth a fortune. The thought was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. They spent the afternoon settling in more comfortably. Sarah found linens in the closet and made up one of the guest beds. She discovered a bathroom with old plumbing that still worked when she tried it, though the water ran rust-colored for several minutes before clearing. Small victories. Tommy entertained himself with the toys from Jenny's room, which Sarah had decided to allow. They were just gathering dust otherwise, and it made her strangely happy to see them being used again, bringing life back into these dead spaces. As the light faded outside, Sarah returned to the locked door at the end of the hall. She stood in front of it, studying the old lock. There had to be a key somewhere. People didn't just throw away keys to rooms in their own house. She started searching systematically. Drawers in the hallway console, shelves in the closet, the pockets of coats hanging in the wardrobe. Nothing. Then she remembered the library, the desk with all the legal papers. People often kept important things near important documents. Sarah went back downstairs and searched the desk more thoroughly. In the bottom drawer, beneath files and folders, she found a small box. Inside were keys, dozens of them, old and new, labeled and unlabeled. She sorted through them, looking for anything that might fit the lock upstairs. Most were clearly for other things: car keys, padlock keys, modern house keys. But at the bottom of the box, she found 3 old skeleton keys on a ring. Sarah took them back upstairs. Tommy was playing quietly in the guest bedroom they'd claimed. Sarah stood in front of the locked door and tried the first key. It didn't fit. The second key slid into the lock but wouldn't turn. The third key fit perfectly. Sarah felt the tumblers catch, felt the mechanism turn. The lock opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the hallway. Sarah pushed the door open slowly. The room beyond was dark. She flipped the light switch, not expecting it to work, but to her surprise, a lamp flickered on. What she saw made her breath catch. This wasn't a bedroom, it was a private study. But unlike the rest of the house, this room wasn't frozen in time. This room was a project. The walls were covered with papers, photographs, newspaper clippings, notes written in a careful hand. Red string connected different pieces, forming a web of information. Sarah stepped into the room, her heart pounding. The air smelled different here, less dusty, as if someone had been in this space more recently than the others. The lamp cast warm light across the walls, illuminating what looked like an investigation board from a detective movie. She moved closer, reading the newspaper clippings pinned to the wall. The headlines jumped out at her. 2 dead in late-night accident on Mountain Road. Hutchins couple killed, 3 children orphaned. Questions remain about fatal crash, all dated from July 1972, the same year the photo album had ended. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the articles. Robert and Marie Hutchins, ages 34 and 32, killed when their car was struck head-on by another vehicle on Route 47. They left behind 3 children: Margaret, age 12, David, age 9, and little Thomas, age 6. The other driver had been 22-year-old Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of local businessman Charles Whitmore. Eleanor had been injured but survived. The article mentioned alcohol may have been involved, but charges were never filed due to insufficient evidence. Sarah sank into the chair at the desk, her mind reeling. Her grandmother had killed 2 people, a drunk driving accident. And somehow it had been covered up. She found more clippings, smaller articles from the weeks following the accident. One mentioned that the Hutchins children had been placed with relatives. Another noted that Eleanor Whitmore had left town and her current whereabouts were unknown. A final piece, dated 6 months later, reported that no charges would be filed in the case. The official story, as pieced together from the articles, was that Robert Hutchins had been driving erratically and crossed into oncoming traffic. Witnesses corroborated this. The investigation was closed. But here, in this room, the truth was laid bare. Sarah found handwritten notes dated from various years. Eleanor's handwriting, she assumed. The notes told a different story. Eleanor admitted to being drunk, admitted to being the one who crossed the center line, admitted that her father, Charles, had paid off witnesses and police to protect her. One note, written in shaking script, said simply, "I killed them. I killed them, and I let innocent people be blamed. I am a coward and a monster." Sarah felt tears burning her eyes. Her grandmother, the quiet woman she barely remembered, had carried this guilt for her entire life, had left this wealthy life because she couldn't bear to benefit from what her father's money had bought. Another note explained the pregnancy. Eleanor had been engaged, but when she discovered she was pregnant after the accident, her fiancé had wanted nothing to do with her, not because of the baby, but because Eleanor was talking about confessing. He'd called her crazy, told her she'd ruin everything. So Eleanor had left, taken nothing but what she could carry, changed her name, started over in a different town, raised her daughter alone. Sarah found a journal, leather-bound and worn. She opened it to a random page and read, "Jenny asked about her father today. I told her he was a good man who loved us but couldn't stay. How do I tell my daughter that her father chose money and reputation over truth, that I chose to run rather than face what I'd done? She deserves better than these lies, but the truth would destroy her." Further on, "Jenny's 16 now, beautiful and smart and kind. Everything I'm not. She wants to know about my family, about where I came from. I tell her we were poor, that there's nothing worth knowing." Another lie to add to all the others. But how can I tell her that she comes from wealth built on suffering, that her grandfather covered up a crime that left 3 children orphaned? And then, near the end of the journal, an entry that made Sarah's breath catch. The cancer is spreading. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of leaving Jenny without the truth. But I'm too much of a coward to tell her while I'm alive. Instead, I'm leaving her this. I've hidden the key to the study in the mansion, in a place where it might be found if anyone ever looks closely enough. Maybe Jenny will find it. Maybe she won't. Maybe it's better if she doesn't. But if she does, or if her children do someday, they'll know. They'll know why I lived the way I did. They'll know about the Hutchins family. And maybe, if there's any justice in this world, they'll do what I never had the courage to do. They'll make it right. Sarah closed the journal, her hands shaking. Her mother had never found this. Jennifer had died young, never knowing the truth about her own mother, about her own family, but Sarah had found it. The secret had passed through one generation and landed in her lap. She looked around the room again, seeing it with new understanding. This wasn't just a confession. It was a plea, a desperate hope that someone would finish what Eleanor couldn't. On the desk, Sarah found a manila folder labeled Hutchins Family. Inside were more notes. Eleanor had tried, in her final years, to track down what had happened to those 3 children. The information was incomplete, gathered before the internet made such searches easier. Margaret Hutchins, the eldest, had raised her brothers after their parents died. She'd dropped out of high school to work. According to Eleanor's notes, she'd spent her life in low-wage jobs, never married, never had the chance for the education she'd deserved. David Hutchins had joined the military at 18, served in Desert Storm, came back with injuries. Eleanor's last note about him mentioned he was living in a VA facility. Thomas Hutchins, the youngest, had struggled with addiction. Eleanor's notes ended with a newspaper clipping about him entering rehab in 1988. 3 lives marked by the loss of their parents. 3 lives that could have been different if Eleanor hadn't been driving drunk that night, if Charles Whitmore hadn't covered it up, if justice had been served. Sarah sat in that room for a long time, reading everything, trying to absorb the weight of what she'd discovered. Her entire understanding of her family had been rewritten in the space of an hour. The poverty she'd grown up with, the way her mother had worked so hard for so little, Eleanor's quiet sadness, all of it made sense now. They'd been living in voluntary exile, atoning for a sin that only Eleanor knew about. And now Sarah knew. She heard Tommy calling from downstairs, probably hungry again. Sarah wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and left the room. She locked the door behind her, putting the key in her pocket. She needed time to think, time to process. Time to figure out what this meant for her, for Tommy, for the future she'd thought was falling apart just days ago. Downstairs, Tommy was examining a set of chess pieces he'd found in a cabinet. "Look, Mom, do you know how to play?" "A little," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "My mother taught me. Can you teach me?" Sarah looked at her son, so innocent, so trusting. He had no idea that the world he knew had just shifted beneath them, that they were standing in a house built on tragedy and secrets, that his great-grandmother had been both victim and villain in a story that was still unfinished. "Sure," Sarah said. "Let's play." They set up the chessboard on the floor by the fire. Sarah taught Tommy the names of the pieces, how each one moved, the basic rules. He caught on quickly, asking thoughtful questions, trying strategies that were surprisingly clever for a 7-year-old. As they played, Sarah's mind kept drifting back to the hidden room, to Eleanor's journal, to the Hutchins family and their derailed lives. She felt the weight of it pressing down on her. This knowledge she now carried. What was she supposed to do with it? The practical part of her brain, the part that had been fighting for survival for weeks, saw the opportunity clearly. This mansion was hers by right of inheritance. She could claim it, sell it, use the money to build a stable life for Tommy. They could move somewhere with better schools, better opportunities. She could finish her nursing degree. Tommy could have the childhood she'd always wanted to give him. But the other part of her, the part that had absorbed her mother's values about integrity and responsibility, recoiled at the idea of profiting from tragedy. How could she build her life on the foundation of suffering her family had caused? "I win," Tommy announced, having captured her king while she was lost in thought. Sarah looked down at the board. You sure did. Good job, buddy. Can we play again? How about we make dinner first? It's getting late. They went to the kitchen together. Sarah heated canned soup on the old stove, which worked after she figured out the pilot light. They ate with proper bowls and spoons she'd found in the cabinets, sitting at the enormous dining room table that could have seated 20. "Mom," Tommy said, swinging his legs under the table, "are we going to stay here?" "I don't know yet. Why do you ask? I like it here. It's big and quiet, and it feels like it's waiting for something." Sarah looked at her son, struck by the observation. "What do you think it's waiting for?" Tommy shrugged. "People, maybe. To live in it again. Houses are sad when they're empty. Out of the mouths of babes," Sarah thought. "You're right. Houses are meant to be lived in." That night, after Tommy was asleep in the guest bed upstairs, Sarah returned to the hidden room. She sat at the desk and went through everything again, more carefully this time. She found something she'd missed before, a large envelope tucked into the back of a drawer. Inside were legal documents, Eleanor's will, written just months before she died. Sarah read it carefully. Eleanor had left everything to her daughter Jennifer, but the estate had never been claimed because Jennifer had no idea it existed. After Jennifer's death, the property should have passed to Sarah, but again, no one knew to claim it. The will also contained instructions, specific instructions about what Eleanor wanted done if the truth ever came out. Sarah read those instructions 3 times, making sure she understood. Eleanor had set aside money separate from the main estate, money from her own life insurance policy and savings, money that was supposed to go to the Hutchins children as restitution. But Eleanor had died before she could make the arrangements, and the money had sat in a trust account, accruing interest. Sarah found the trust documents. The account had grown substantially over the years. It was now worth nearly $500,000. Eleanor's instructions were clear. "If this is ever found, I beg whoever finds it to ensure this money reaches Robert and Marie Hutchins's children. It won't bring their parents back, it won't erase the pain, but it's something. It's all I have to offer. Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I was a coward who ran instead of facing what I'd done. Tell them I've carried the weight of it every day of my life." Sarah sat back in the chair, overwhelmed. Her grandmother had tried to make amends, even from beyond the grave, had set up this elaborate system of breadcrumbs and hidden truths, hoping someone would follow them and finish what she'd started. And now Sarah had to decide, would she honor that wish, or would she keep the money for herself? After all, no one would know. The Hutchins family didn't know this money existed. She could simply claim the entire estate and walk away. But she would know, and Tommy would eventually know. And what kind of lesson would that teach him about integrity, about responsibility, about making things right even when it cost you? Sarah thought about her mother. Jennifer had worked herself to exhaustion, had died too young, had never had anything easy or comfortable. She'd done that because Eleanor had passed down a legacy of atonement, even without explaining why. Now it was Sarah's turn to carry that legacy forward. She made her decision. The storm finally broke the next morning. Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes in golden shafts. The world outside was transformed, covered in pristine white snow that sparkled like diamonds. Tommy was already awake, his nose pressed to the window. "Mom, look, it's so pretty." Sarah joined him, and they stood together looking out at the winter wonderland. The mountains in the distance were sharp and clear against a brilliant blue sky. "We need to hike back to the car," Sarah said. "See if it's drivable. If not, we'll have to walk to the road and flag someone down. Can we come back here?" Sarah looked at him. "What do you mean? After we go home and get our stuff, can we come back and live here?" "Maybe," Sarah said. "There are a lot of things we need to figure out first. But maybe." They bundled up in coats they found in the closet, old but warm. The walk back to the car was easier in daylight. The storm had buried their sedan completely. There was no way they were driving it anywhere without a tow truck. Instead, they walked to the main road. It took an hour, trudging through deep snow, but Tommy was a trooper. He didn't complain once, just kept moving forward with the determination Sarah loved about him. On the road, a county snowplow stopped for them. The driver, a man in his 50s with a weathered face, looked concerned. "You folks okay? What are you doing out here?" "Our car went off the road during the storm," Sarah explained. "We found shelter in a house nearby." "Which house?" "The big mansion, the Whitmore estate." The driver's eyebrows rose. "That place has been empty for 30 years. How'd you get in?" The door was unlocked. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Well, you're lucky you found it. That storm was a bad one. Could have been a lot worse for you. I can give you a ride to Pine Valley. There's a motel there, and you can arrange for a tow." "Thank you," Sarah said. "That would be wonderful." In the truck's warm cab, Tommy fell asleep almost immediately. The driver made conversation, asking where they were from, where they were headed. Sarah answered vaguely, not ready to explain the full story. When they reached Pine Valley, the driver dropped them at a small motel. Sarah checked them in, using her credit card and hoping it wouldn't be declined. It went through. Small mercies. In the motel room with Tommy napping on one of the beds, Sarah pulled out her phone. She'd charged it using the truck's USB port, and the screen had survived despite the cracks. She had service here. She had calls to make, lawyers to contact, a future to figure out. Sarah spent 3 days in Pine Valley making arrangements. She called Mrs. Morrison to let her know they were safe. She contacted a tow company for the car, and she found a lawyer, an older woman named Patricia Grant, who specialized in estate law. Patricia's office was in a converted house on Main Street. The lawyer herself was in her 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the air of someone who'd seen every trick in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. Sarah laid out the situation as clearly as she could. Her grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, the abandoned mansion, the death of Charles Whitmore in 1995 without a will, her mother Jennifer's death in 2008, her own status as sole surviving heir. Patricia listened without interrupting, making notes on a yellow legal pad. When Sarah finished, the lawyer sat back in her chair. "This is quite a story," she said. "Do you have any documentation? Birth certificates, marriage licenses, anything that proves your relationship to Eleanor Whitmore?" "My mother's birth certificate lists Eleanor Whitmore as her mother," Sarah said, "and I have my own birth certificate listing Jennifer Chen as my mother. My mother's marriage license has her maiden name as Whitmore. That should be sufficient. The bigger question is whether the estate has already been settled or claimed by the state." "You said Charles Whitmore died in 1995, according to the documents I found in the house. Then we're potentially looking at a 30-year-old probate case. That's going to take some digging, but if you're the rightful heir and the property hasn't been claimed, then yes, you could have a valid claim to the estate." Sarah felt relief and anxiety in equal measure. How long would something like this take? Months, probably, maybe a year. Estate law moves slowly, especially with cases this old. "But I'll start the research and file the preliminary paperwork. In the meantime, you should document everything you found in that house. Photographs, copies of documents, anything that supports your claim." They discussed fees, which made Sarah's stomach tighten, but Patricia offered to work on contingency, taking a percentage of the estate if successful. It was the only way Sarah could afford to proceed. Back at the motel, Sarah researched the Hutchins family. It wasn't hard to find them. In the age of social media and online records, people left trails. Margaret Hutchins was 64 now, living in a town called Riverside, just 2 hours from Pine Ridge. According to what Sarah could find, she'd worked most of her life as a grocery store clerk, retiring on Social Security and a small pension. She'd never married, had no children. David Hutchins had died 5 years ago, complications from his war injuries. He'd left behind a daughter, Amy, who was now in her 30s and working as a teacher. Thomas Hutchins, the youngest, had gotten sober in his 40s and was now a counselor at the same rehab facility that had saved his life. He had 2 children, both adults. Sarah looked at their faces in the photos she found online. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. Lives that had been shaped by the loss of their parents more than 50 years ago. She printed out what she could, made notes, created a file. When the time came, she would need to find them, to tell them the truth, to give them the money Eleanor had set aside. But first, she needed to make sure that money was really hers to give. The car was towed to a garage in Pine Valley. The mechanic looked it over and gave Sarah the bad news: frame damage, engine problems, more repair costs than the car was worth. He offered her $500 for scrap. She took it. With no car and no way to get back to Pine Ridge immediately, Sarah and Tommy stayed in Pine Valley. They fell into a routine. Breakfast at the diner across from the motel, walks through the small town, evenings watching television in the motel room or playing the card games Tommy was learning at school. It was a strange kind of limbo, waiting for news from the lawyer, waiting for the next step, waiting to see if Sarah's life was about to change completely or if this was all going to collapse into nothing. On the fourth day, Patricia called. "I've found the probate records," she said. "The Whitmore estate was never claimed. The property has been in a kind of legal limbo for 30 years. With your documentation, I believe we can establish your claim." "But Sarah, there's something else you need to know." Sarah's heart sank. "What is it?" "The estate is larger than you probably realized. The mansion itself, plus 200 acres of land. There are also financial holdings, stocks and bonds that have been sitting in accounts. The total value is somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 million. Sarah sat down heavily on the motel bed. "I'm sorry, what?" $3 million, give or take. Obviously, taxes will take a chunk, and my fees, but even so, you're looking at a substantial inheritance." The room seemed to tilt. Sarah put her hand on the nightstand to steady herself. Tommy looked up from his coloring book, curious. "That's not possible," Sarah said. "How could it just be sitting there? How could no one claim it? The state doesn't move quickly on these things, and the property was in such a remote location that it fell through the cracks. It happens more than you'd think." "But Sarah, there's one more thing." "What?" "I found records of the trust account you mentioned. The one Eleanor set up for the Hutchins family. It's legitimate, and the money is there, as you said. About $480,000. But here's the thing. Eleanor's will specifies that the executor of her estate must ensure that money reaches the Hutchins children. If you accept the inheritance, you become the executor. You're legally obligated to follow through." Sarah closed her eyes. "Good, good. I was going to do it anyway. I'm glad it's legally required. It makes the decision easier." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Not many people would see it that way. Most would look for loopholes. "I'm not most people," Sarah said, "and my grandmother spent her life trying to make this right. I'm not going to be the one who undoes that. All right then, I'll move forward with the claim. But I want you to think carefully about what you're taking on. This is going to be public. The Hutchins family is going to find out what really happened. There could be anger, legal challenges, media attention. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah thought about Margaret Hutchins, who'd given up her childhood to raise her brothers. About David's daughter Amy, who'd grown up without a grandfather. About Thomas's children, who'd never known their grandparents. "They deserve the truth," Sarah said, "whatever comes with it." Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia worked on establishing Sarah's claim. Sarah provided all the documentation she could: birth certificates, marriage licenses, photographs. She even returned to the mansion with a photographer Patricia recommended, documenting everything in the hidden room. The mansion looked different in the daylight, without the terror of the storm. Beautiful but sad, like something waiting to wake up. Tommy ran through the rooms with delight, as if greeting an old friend. Sarah stood in the hidden room again, looking at Eleanor's careful documentation of her guilt. She thought about the journey that had brought her here. The accident, the eviction notice, the desperate drive through the snow. Every piece of her life falling apart, only to lead her to this. Her phone rang. "Patricia." "The claim is approved," the lawyer said. "Congratulations, Sarah. You're officially the owner of the Whitmore estate." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. "Thank you. Now comes the hard part. We need to contact the Hutchins family. I can do it through formal legal channels, but given the nature of what we retelling them, you might want to consider a more personal approach." "I'll do it," Sarah said. "I'll reach out to them directly." "Are you sure?" Sarah looked around the room, at Eleanor's decades-old confession, at the evidence of a guilt that had shaped 3 generations. "I'm sure. They shouldn't hear this from a lawyer's letter, They should hear it from family. Technically, you're not family to them. No, Sarah said. But my grandmother took something irreplaceable from them. That creates a connection, whether we want it or not. I owe them the respect of facing them directly. She spent that evening crafting a letter, not a legal document, but a personal one, explaining who she was, what she'd discovered, what she wanted to do about it. She wrote it by hand, crossing out mistakes, starting over, trying to find words adequate for something so enormous. There were no adequate words, but she tried anyway. The letter to Margaret Hutchins took Sarah 3 days to write. She went through dozens of drafts, each one failing to capture what she needed to say. How do you tell someone that your grandmother killed their parents and covered it up? How do you offer money as compensation for a childhood lost, a family destroyed? In the end, Sarah kept it simple. Dear Miss Hutchins, my name is Sarah Chen. You don't know me, but my grandmother was Eleanor Whitmore. I've recently discovered information about the accident that killed your parents in 1972, and I need to speak with you about it. What I have to tell you will be difficult to hear, but I believe you have a right to know the truth. I'm also in possession of something that belongs to you and your brothers. If you're willing, I'd like to meet with you in person. I understand if you'd prefer not to respond. I'll respect whatever decision you make. With sincere regards, Sarah Chen. She included her phone number and mailed the letter, then waited. The response came faster than she expected. 3 days later, her phone rang from an unknown number. "This is Margaret Hutchins," a woman's voice said. "Careful, controlled. I got your letter." Sarah's heart pounded. "Miss Hutchins, thank you for calling. I almost didn't. Spent 2 days looking at that envelope, trying to decide if I wanted to know what was inside. But my brother Thomas said I'd regret it if I didn't open it. Here I am. I appreciate that. I know this is difficult. You said you have information about my parents' accident, about Eleanor Whitmore." Margaret's voice hardened slightly. "That woman left town right after the accident. People said she was drunk, that she was the one who crossed the center line, but the investigation cleared her, said it was my father's fault." Sarah closed her eyes. "The investigation was wrong. Miss Hutchins, what I'm about to tell you is going to change how you understand what happened. I want you to know that I'm telling you because it's the right thing to do, not because I have to, and I want you to know that I'm profoundly sorry for what my family did to yours." There was a long silence. "Then, tell me." Sarah told her everything. Eleanor's confession, Charles Whitmore's cover-up, the witnesses who were paid to lie, the evidence that was destroyed, Eleanor's lifetime of guilt and her desperate attempts to atone, the trust fund that had been waiting for 50 years to reach its intended recipients. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished, there was only breathing on the other end of the line. "Miss Hutchins?" Sarah said quietly. "Are you still there?" "I'm here." The voice was thick with tears. "I'm just trying to process. All these years we believed the lie. David went to his grave thinking our father was drunk, thinking he caused it. Thomas struggled with addiction partly because he believed he came from a family of substance abusers, and it was all a lie. I'm so sorry. Don't apologize. It's not your fault. You weren't even born yet." A pause. "This trust fund, you said it's nearly $500,000? "Yes. 480,000 approximately. It's legally designated for you and your brother's families." "I don't want blood money." Sarah had expected this. "I understand that feeling. But Miss Hutchins, this money represents Eleanor's attempt to make amends. She couldn't undo what happened, but she wanted to give you and your brothers something. A chance at the life you should have had. David's daughter, your nephew and niece, they could all benefit. It won't bring your parents back, but it could help build a future." Another long silence. "I need to talk to Thomas and David's daughter Amy. This affects all of us." "Of course. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." "Why are you doing this?" Margaret asked suddenly. "You inherited millions. You could have kept the trust fund, and no one would have known. Why tell us?" Sarah thought about Tommy, about the values she wanted to instill in him, about her mother and grandmother, both shaped by secrets and guilt. "Because my son is watching. Because the only way to break a cycle is to choose differently, and because it's the right thing to do. Your grandmother, Margaret said slowly. She must have been a good person underneath it all. To carry that guilt for so long, to try to make it right. She was complicated, Sarah said. She made a terrible mistake and spent her life paying for it. But yes, I think underneath the fear and guilt, she was trying to be good. They talked for another hour. Margaret told stories about her parents, about the life they'd had before the accident, about raising her brothers, about the struggles and small triumphs, about David's service and Amy's teaching career, about Thomas's recovery and his work helping others. By the end of the call, something had shifted. They weren't friends, not yet, but they'd established a connection built on honesty. "I'd like to meet you," Margaret said, face to face. "Would that be all right?" "I'd like that very much," Sarah said. They arranged to meet the following week at a coffee shop in Riverside, halfway between their two towns. Margaret said she'd bring Thomas and Amy. They wanted to hear the full story together. Sarah spent the week preparing. She gathered all of Eleanor's documents, made copies of everything. Patricia helped her draft the paperwork to transfer the trust fund. Sarah also made a decision about the mansion. She called Patricia into a meeting and laid out her plan. "I want to convert the mansion into a community resource center," Sarah said. "A place that provides services to people in crisis. Shelter, job training, counseling, support. I want it to be open to anyone who needs it." Patricia raised her eyebrows. "That's ambitious and expensive. I know, but I've been thinking about what Eleanor wanted. She didn't just want to give money to the Hutchins family. She wanted to make amends for the harm she caused. The best way I can think to do that is to turn the symbol of her privilege into something that helps others. What about you and Tommy? Where will you live? There's enough space to have a small private residence for us, but the majority of the mansion will be dedicated to the center. I'm calling it Eleanor House. After your grandmother? After the woman she tried to be," Sarah said. "Not the scared girl who made a mistake, but the person who spent 50 years trying to make it right." Patricia studied her for a long moment. "You're sure about this? You could sell that property, take the money, set yourself up for life. No one would blame you." "I would blame me," Sarah said. "And more importantly, Tommy would learn that it's okay to profit from other people's suffering. I can't teach him that." The lawyer smiled, something rare and genuine. "Your grandmother would be proud of you." "I hope so," Sarah said. "I really hope so." The day of the meeting arrived. Sarah drove to Riverside with Tommy, who'd insisted on coming. She'd tried to convince him to stay with Mrs. Morrison, but he'd been adamant. "They're part of our family's story," he'd said with 7-year-old logic. "I should be there." The coffee shop was small and local, with mismatched furniture and art by local artists on the walls. Sarah arrived early and chose a table in the corner. Tommy sat beside her, unusually quiet, sensing the importance of the moment. Margaret Hutchins arrived exactly on time. Sarah recognized her from the photos she'd found online, but seeing her in person was different. She was small, her grey hair cut short, her face lined with 64 years of living. But her eyes were sharp and clear, missing nothing. Behind her came a younger woman, mid-30s, with Margaret's same sharp gaze, David's daughter Amy, and a man in his late 50s, solid and steady-looking. Thomas. Sarah stood, her heart pounding. "Miss Hutchins." "Thank you for coming." Margaret looked at her for a long moment, taking her measure. Then, unexpectedly, she held out her hand. "Call me Margaret, and this is my brother Thomas, and my niece Amy." They shook hands all around. Tommy stood and introduced himself with the politeness Sarah had taught him. The Hutchins family looked at him with expressions Sarah couldn't quite read. They sat, a waitress took their orders, and then there was nothing left but the truth. Sarah had brought all of Eleanor's documents in a folder. She slid it across the table to Margaret. "This is everything. Eleanor's journal, her confession, the newspaper clippings, all of it. I thought you should have the originals." Margaret opened the folder and began reading. Amy and Thomas leaned in to look. Sarah watched their faces change as they absorbed the truth. Shock, anger, grief, all playing across their features. When Margaret reached Eleanor's final entries, tears rolled down her cheeks. "She tried," she whispered. "She really tried to make it right." "She did," Sarah said, "for whatever that's worth." Thomas looked up, his jaw tight. It doesn't bring David back, doesn't undo what we went through. No, Sarah agreed. It doesn't. Nothing can. But I'm hoping it can help build something better going forward. She explained about the trust fund, about the legal process to transfer it. She explained about Eleanor House, about her plans to turn the mansion into a community center. "You're giving up millions," Amy said, disbelief in her voice. "To do this?" "I'm not giving it up," Sarah said. "I'm using it the way it should be used, to help people, to create something good from something terrible." Margaret was still crying, but there was something else in her face now, something like hope. "When can we see it, the mansion?" "Whenever you'd like," Sarah said. "It's part of your story too." The visit to the mansion happened 2 weeks later. Sarah spent those weeks having it cleaned, the utilities restored, the basic repairs done. She wanted the Hutchins family to see it as it had been, not buried under decades of dust and neglect. Margaret, Thomas and Amy arrived on a Saturday morning. Tommy was at Mrs. Morrison's, giving the adults space for what Sarah knew would be an emotional day. Sarah met them at the gates, which she'd had repaired and painted. The driveway was cleared of snow, revealing the elegant curve of it through the trees. As they walked toward the mansion, Margaret stopped several times, looking around. "I've driven past these gates 100 times," she said. "Never knew what was back here. Never imagined." The mansion looked magnificent in the spring sunlight. Sarah had opened all the windows, letting fresh air chase away the mustiness. Inside, the marble floors gleamed. The chandelier had been cleaned and now sparkled. Margaret stood in the foyer, turning slowly. This is where she lived, where she came from. "Yes," Sarah said, "and where my mother spent the first 5 years of her life before Eleanor left." They moved through the rooms. Sarah showed them the portraits, the dining room, the library. She told them what she knew about Charles Whitmore, about the wealth and influence he'd wielded, about how Eleanor had walked away from all of it. In the library, Thomas found the newspaper clippings Sarah had framed and hung on the wall, articles about his parents, the obituaries, the sparse coverage of the accident. "I was 6 years old," he said quietly. "I barely remember them, just impressions. My mother's laugh, my father lifting me up. Margaret remembers more." Margaret was looking at a photograph Sarah had found and enlarged. Robert and Marie Hutchins on their wedding day, young and happy. "They were good people," she said. "They worked hard. They loved us." "It should have been enough to keep them safe." "I'm sorry it wasn't," Sarah said. They climbed the stairs to the second floor. Sarah showed them Jenny's room, explained that this had been her mother's childhood bedroom. Amy was particularly interested in this, examining the toys and books that had belonged to a little girl 50 years ago. Then Sarah led them to the end of the hall, to the locked room that had held Eleanor's secrets. "This is the hardest part," Sarah said, "but I think you need to see it." She unlocked the door and stepped back, letting them enter first. The walls were still covered with Eleanor's documentation, the timeline of events, the newspaper clippings, the confession, the photographs. But Sarah had added something, a memorial wall, pictures of Robert and Marie Hutchins, pictures of Margaret, David and Thomas as children, information about their lives, their accomplishments, their families. Margaret moved to this wall and stood before it, her hand over her mouth. "You did this?" "I wanted them to be remembered," Sarah said, "not just as victims, but as people, as parents, as the center of a family that deserved better." Thomas was reading Eleanor's journal entries, which Sarah had typed up and mounted on the wall. His face was wet with tears. She never forgave herself. "No," Sarah said, "she didn't. And maybe that was right. Maybe some things shouldn't be forgiven. But she tried to make amends, and I think that means something." Amy had found the trust documents. She read them carefully, then looked at Sarah. "This money has been waiting all this time, just waiting for someone to do the right thing." "Eleanor couldn't do it while she was alive," Sarah said. "She was too afraid. But she made sure someone could do it after she was gone. She just had to trust that the right person would find it." "And you did," Margaret said. "By accident." "Was it an accident?" Sarah wondered aloud. "Sometimes I think about the chain of events, losing my job, the eviction notice, the desperate drive through the storm, the crash, each thing leading to the next, pushing me toward this place. Maybe Eleanor was nudging me along somehow. Thomas smiled slightly. That's a nice thought, that she's still here, still trying to make things right. They spent hours in that room, reading everything, asking questions, crying, talking. Sarah told them about her own life, about growing up poor, about never understanding why her mother worked so hard for so little, about Tommy and the struggles of single parenthood, about the accident that had started this whole journey. So you were desperate too, Margaret said, looking for help, looking for family. I was, Sarah admitted. I was at the end of my rope. And I ended up here, in the last place I expected. And now you're giving away your inheritance to help strangers, Amy said. To create this community center. Why? Sarah thought about how to answer. Because Tommy is watching. Because I want him to grow up understanding that money isn't the most important thing, that integrity matters, that we have a responsibility to others, especially when we've been given more than we need. More than you need? Thomas laughed, but not unkindly. Sarah, you showed up here because you were about to be evicted. You're a single mother with medical bills and no job. You could use this money. I know, Sarah said, and I'm keeping enough to be stable, to finish my nursing degree, to give Tommy a good life. But the rest, the mansion, the land, most of the estate, it should be used for something that matters. Eleanor spent her whole life in voluntary poverty, atoning for what she'd done. I'm not going to undo that by living in luxury built on tragedy. Margaret stood and crossed to Sarah. Without warning, she pulled her into a hug. Sarah stiffened in surprise, then relaxed into it. Thank you, Margaret whispered, for telling us the truth, for honoring our parents' memory, for being the person Eleanor hoped would find this. When they pulled apart, everyone in the room was crying, including Sarah. They went back downstairs and talked about practical matters. The trust fund would be divided 3 ways, to Margaret, to Thomas, and to Amy on behalf of David's share. Patricia had already drawn up the paperwork. The transfers would happen within a month. Sarah also showed them the plans for Eleanor House. The ground floor would be converted into common spaces, a commercial kitchen, dining room, meeting rooms, counseling offices. The second floor would have bedrooms for people in crisis situations. The third floor would be Sarah and Tommy's private residence. We'll provide emergency shelter, job training, mental health services, and practical support, Sarah explained. Everything I wished I'd had when I was at my lowest. Can we help? Amy asked suddenly. I'm a teacher. I could volunteer, teach classes, help with job training. Thomas nodded. I'm a counselor. I work with people in recovery. I'd like to be part of this. Margaret smiled. I may be retired, but I can still cook, and I've got time, plenty of time. Sarah felt emotion welling up in her chest. You do that? After everything? After everything, Margaret said firmly. Your grandmother took our parents from us. But you're giving us a chance to make their memory mean something, to help others the way they would have helped if they'd lived. That's worth being part of. They made plans. Amy would develop an educational program. Thomas would oversee counseling services. Margaret would manage the kitchen and food programs. Sarah would coordinate everything and finish the nursing degree that would let her provide medical support. As the day ended and the Hutchins family prepared to leave, Margaret took Sarah aside. I need you to understand something, she said. What your grandmother did was wrong. The cover-up was wrong. We lost so much because of it. But what you're doing, what you're building, it doesn't erase that. It doesn't make it okay. I know, Sarah said. But, Margaret continued, it does mean something. It means the story doesn't end with tragedy. It means something good can come from something terrible. And maybe that's the best any of us can hope for. Not erasing the past, but building a different future. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Your grandmother would be proud of you, Margaret said, and I think, despite everything, I'm grateful she raised a daughter who raised a woman like you. After they left, Sarah stood alone in the mansion. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the marble floor. She thought about Eleanor, about the scared young woman who'd made a terrible mistake, about the decades of guilt and penance, about the elaborate plan to make amends from beyond the grave. She thought about her mother, Jennifer, who'd worked so hard and died so young, never knowing the truth about her own history. She thought about Tommy, who would grow up in this house, who would see daily evidence that doing the right thing mattered more than personal comfort. And she thought about the Hutchins family, who'd lost so much and somehow found the grace to forgive, to help, to build something better. Sarah walked to the portrait of Eleanor and looked up at that young, serious face. "I hope I'm doing this right," she said aloud. "I hope this is what you wanted." The house was silent, but Sarah felt something, a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place, of a story that had been broken, finally finding a way to mend. She pulled out her phone and called Patricia. "I'm ready to finalize everything, the trust transfers, the foundation paperwork, all of it. Let's make this official." "You're sure?" Patricia asked. Sarah looked around at the mansion, at the space that would soon be filled with people in need, with programs and services and hope. "I've never been more sure of anything." That night, Sarah picked up Tommy from Mrs. Morrison's and brought him to the mansion. They sat in the library, surrounded by books and firelight, and Sarah told him the whole story. Everything. Eleanor's mistake, the cover-up, the Hutchins family, the trust fund, the plans for Eleanor House. Tommy listened with wide eyes, processing it all with the remarkable emotional intelligence of childhood. 3 months later, Sarah stood at the gates of the mansion and watched as workers installed the new sign. Brass letters on a wooden plaque, Eleanor House, Community Resource Center. Tommy stood beside her, holding her hand. At 7 years old, he understood more than most children his age. He understood that his great-grandmother had done something terrible and spent her life trying to make it right. He understood that sometimes the right choice was the hard choice. He understood that family legacy wasn't just about money or property, but about values and actions. "It looks good," he said, squeezing her hand. "It does," Sarah agreed. The mansion had been transformed. The ground floor now held a commercial kitchen where Margaret presided over meal preparation for the community meals they served 3 times a week. There was a computer lab where Amy taught job skills and helped people write resumes. There were counseling offices where Thomas and his colleagues worked with people struggling with addiction, trauma, and life transitions. The bedrooms on the 2nd floor were simple but comfortable, providing temporary housing for people in crisis. Single mothers fleeing domestic violence, people recently released from the hospital with nowhere to go, families recovering from disasters, anyone who needed help and had nowhere else to turn. Sarah's nursing degree was nearly complete. She studied at night while Tommy slept, driven by the knowledge that soon she'd be able to provide medical services to the people Eleanor House served. Her shoulder had healed completely, stronger than it had been before. The Hutchins family had become part of Sarah's extended family. Margaret came twice a week to cook and share stories. Amy volunteered on weekends, bringing her husband and children. Thomas was there almost daily, his dedication to helping others as fierce as his own recovery had been. They'd held a memorial service for Robert and Marie Hutchins on what would have been their 80th birthdays. Sarah had commissioned a plaque that now hung in the entrance hall, in memory of Robert and Marie Hutchins, whose lives were cut short, but whose legacy lives on in every person helped by this house. The financial settlement from the trust had changed the Hutchins family's lives in practical ways. Margaret had paid off her house and set up college funds for her great-nieces and great-nephews. Thomas had expanded the rehab program he worked for. Amy had started a scholarship fund for children who'd lost parents. But more than the money, they'd gained something they'd never had before, the truth. They knew now that their parents hadn't been at fault, that Robert Hutchins hadn't been drunk, hadn't been reckless, that Marie Hutchins hadn't died because of her husband's mistakes. The family name had been cleared, even if only privately, among those who knew the real story. Sarah had kept enough of the estate to be comfortable, not wealthy but stable. She'd paid off her medical bills, set up a college fund for Tommy, and invested in her education. The rest went to Eleanor House, to maintaining it, to funding its programs, to ensuring it could serve the community for generations. Mrs. Morrison had moved into one of the 3rd-floor apartments, refusing to let Sarah live alone with Tommy in such a big house. "Someone needs to keep an eye on you," she'd said. "Make sure you don't work yourself to death the way your mother did."